In the quiet Alabama spring of 2002, a beloved young teacher vanished without a trace. Her name was Emily Ray Dorsett, 27 years old, bright, compassionate, and adored by her students. What began as a missing persons plea soon turned into a mystery that haunted a small town for 2 decades. Before we begin, remember to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss stories where justice finally finds its voice. Because this case ends with a revelation no one expected. In 2002, the small Alabama town of Willow Creek was the kind of place where life moved slowly. Days were marked by the ringing of church bells, high school football games, and the hum of cicadas after dark. It was the kind of town where people left their doors unlocked, where neighbors waved at passing cars, and where everyone knew the rhythm of everyone else's life. For 27-year-old Emily Ray Dorsett, that rhythm was steady and full of purpose. She taught 2nd grade at Oak Hill Elementary, a squat brick building at the edge of town surrounded by magnolia trees. Her classroom was a splash of color, paper butterflies hanging from the ceiling, construction paper suns lining the walls, and a bookshelf packed with stories she'd collected over the years. Her students adored her. Parents described her as patient, kind, and impossibly organized. She was, as one colleague later said, the heartbeat of that hallway. Emily lived alone in a small apartment just 2 miles from the school. It wasn't much, just 2 rooms and a balcony overlooking a quiet courtyard, but she filled it with life. The walls were lined with Polaroids of her students, holding up spelling bee trophies or science projects. Her bookshelves overflowed with lesson plans and library finds. On weekends, she volunteered at the local library, tutoring children who struggled to read. Her parents, Jim and Martha Dorsett, lived nearby. They often had Emily over for dinner on Sundays, where the conversation was easy and familiar. School updates, new students, and church events. She was our calm, Martha would later say in an interview. When Emily was in the room, everything just felt right. By all accounts, her life was simple, predictable, good. She went jogging before dawn, stopped for coffee at the same corner cafe, and drove the same route to school each morning. Her circle of friends included other teachers, a childhood friend named Sarah, and a handful of church members who joined her for Bible study each Wednesday night. But even the safest towns have shadows. Neighbors would later recall a few things that seemed odd at the time but harmless then. A car parked near her complex for several nights in a row. Headlights idling just long enough to draw attention. A co-worker mentioned a phone call Emily received one afternoon that seemed to unsettle her. When asked, she'd brushed it off, said it was nothing worth worrying about. There were also whispers of an unwanted admirer, a maintenance worker, who had once lingered near her classroom door a little too long. He'd asked her out twice and she'd politely declined. He quit soon after. Police would later revisit that name. Still, there was no real fear, not then. Willow Creek prided itself on being untouched by the kinds of tragedies that made the news in bigger cities. In that small Alabama town, danger was something that happened elsewhere. But the final weeks of Emily's life carried an undercurrent of unease, subtle enough to go unnoticed until it was too late. Friends recalled her seeming distracted at times, glancing over her shoulder in parking lots, locking her doors twice before heading to bed. Her journal, later found in her apartment, hinted at vague anxiety, entries about a car that didn't belong and feeling watched. To everyone around her, Emily remained the same cheerful teacher with the sunshine smile. But something or someone had begun to intrude on her quiet routine. No one in Willow Creek could have known that these ordinary days were the prelude to something far darker. Who was watching Emily, and why would her peaceful, predictable life soon become the timeline of a crime? April 18th, 2002. The warmth of spring hung over Willow Creek, Alabama, as the school day wound down at Oak Hill Elementary. For most teachers, the evening meant heading home to families or errands. But for Emily Ray Dorsett, it was another late night in her classroom. She stayed behind to finish grading spelling tests and finalize lesson plans for an upcoming parent-teacher meeting. The janitor would later recall seeing her through the window, head bent over a stack of papers, fluorescent light spilling onto the hallway floor. At 7:45 p.m., Emily called her mother. It was a short conversation, routine, affectionate, ordinary. She promised to stop by for dinner that weekend. "Love you," were the last words her mother ever heard from her daughter. After that call, Emily vanished into silence. When the school opened the next morning, her car was still parked neatly by the side entrance. The driver's door was locked, her purse gone. At first, co-workers assumed she'd caught a ride home or left with a friend. But by mid-morning, unease replaced curiosity. Emily never missed class, never failed to call if she was running late. By noon, the principal called the police. Officers arrived and began a cursory check of the building and surrounding grounds. Nothing appeared out of place. No signs of struggle, no broken glass, no evidence of forced entry. Inside her classroom, everything was as she'd left it. A stack of graded papers, her favorite coffee mug still half full, and her keys sitting neatly beside the desk. Detectives canvassed the area. They interviewed other teachers, janitors and parents who had attended evening activities the night before. A few recalled seeing Emily in the parking lot around 8. One parent mentioned a dark sedan idling nearby, its headlights off. Another person thought they saw Emily talking to someone near her car. But in a small town like Willow Creek, details blurred quickly. The police reviewed surveillance footage from a nearby gas station located a block away. The grainy tape captured what looked like Emily's white sedan in the background, and a second, darker car pulling alongside. A figure stepped out and approached her. The footage was too distorted to identify faces, but the interaction seemed tense. After that, both vehicles disappeared from view. As word spread, the community mobilized. Volunteers printed flyers bearing Emily's smiling photo. Missing, please help find Emily Dorset. Local news stations covered the story nightly. Dozens of residents gathered at the high school gym to organize search teams. They combed through dense pine woods, creek beds, and back roads, guided by flashlights and faith. For days, hope refused to die. Her parents made public pleas, urging anyone with information to come forward. Strangers delivered casseroles and candles to the Dorset home, while prayer circles formed at local churches. In a town unaccustomed to tragedy, the disappearance of a beloved teacher felt unthinkable. Detectives followed every lead: a reported sighting on Highway 82, a phone call from someone claiming to have seen Emily's car in a nearby county. Each lead ended in disappointment. No ransom notes, no confirmed sightings, no trace of Emily. After a week, optimism began to fracture. The posters faded under rain, and volunteers returned to their jobs. The Dorset family clung to faith, but silence grew heavier with each passing hour. Police expanded their search radius, bringing in cadaver dogs and helicopters. Still nothing until day 7. A group of local hikers made their way through an overgrown trail 15 miles outside of town. What they stumbled upon would change everything. It was a shallow indentation in the earth, freshly disturbed. Something pale beneath the dirt caught the light. They froze, realizing what they had found before anyone could say it aloud. When the searchers made their grim discovery, nothing could prepare them or the town for what they found. 7 days after Emily Ray Dorset vanished, the hope that she might still be alive was fading. The town of Willow Creek had searched every inch of surrounding forest and farmland, but no one expected the discovery to come from a lone hiker. It was a quiet Sunday morning, April 25, 2002. The man was walking along an abandoned service road about 15 miles outside town, an area overgrown and rarely used. He noticed something strange just off the shoulder, an uneven patch of soil, too freshly disturbed to blend with the wild grass. When he leaned closer, sunlight caught something pale beneath the dirt. It was enough to make him step back, fumble for his phone, and call 911. Within an hour, flashing red and blue lights sliced through the pine trees. Investigators sealed off the scene, pushing back curious locals who had followed the police chatter. The shallow grave was carefully uncovered. What they found beneath was every parent's nightmare, what the town had prayed they'd never have to face. The body was quickly identified as Emily through dental records. For detectives, the scene raised more questions than it answered. Emily had been carefully placed, her body covered just enough to delay discovery. The medical examiner's preliminary report confirmed she had been strangled. No weapon, no gunshot wounds. There were faint bruises on her neck and defensive wounds across her hands, suggesting she had fought back. There were no signs of sexual assault. Whoever did this had wanted her gone, but not humiliated. It was personal and controlled. The dirt road itself was isolated, accessible only by someone familiar with the area. Tire impressions were faint, almost erased by the week's heavy rainfall. The rain had also washed away footprints and trace evidence that might have held the key to identifying the killer. A discarded soda can, a single cigarette butt, even a torn piece of fabric, all were collected, bagged and logged, but none immediately pointed toward a suspect. Inside the Willow Creek Police Department, shock turned to pressure. The small-town force was unaccustomed to homicide, much less one this brutal. The county sheriff called in state investigators to assist. Detectives began reconstructing Emily's final hours, poring over her phone records and interviewing anyone who might have seen her that night. Her co-workers described her as cheerful and calm the day she disappeared. One custodian recalled seeing her walking to her car after dark, carrying a tote bag filled with graded papers. Another witness, a delivery driver, reported noticing a dark vehicle parked near the back of the school around the same time. He couldn't make out the make or model. Investigators turned their attention to those closest to Emily. They interviewed her ex-boyfriend, a local mechanic named David Lang, who had dated her the previous year. David was cooperative, distraught even, and his alibi checked out. He'd been out of town at a racing event. Still, rumors spread. In a town that had never experienced such horror, suspicion became its own kind of contagion. The Dorset family was shattered. Emily's parents refused to speak publicly at first. Her mother, Martha, spent hours sitting in her daughter's classroom after police released it, surrounded by the paper cutouts her students had made. "She loved those kids," she whispered to a local reporter. "She didn't deserve this." Days passed, and though the investigation intensified, leads evaporated. Fingerprints came back inconclusive. The soda can held DNA, but it was too degraded to process with the technology available at the time. The case that began with such urgency was suddenly standing on the edge of silence. Who could have wanted Emily dead, and how could someone commit such a crime without leaving a trace? The first 6 months after the discovery of Emily Ray Dorset's body were marked by chaos and desperation. The Willow Creek Police Department, unaccustomed to major crimes, suddenly found itself at the center of Alabama's most closely watched investigation of 2002. The once quiet community became a swirl of police cars, media vans, and late-night strategy sessions. Every day brought new theories and new dead ends. Detectives chased every rumor. Anonymous tips flooded in. A suspicious man seen at the gas station, a drifter who'd passed through town, an ex-boyfriend who'd seemed off after the breakup. Some claims came from attention seekers, others from genuinely frightened residents. One local even confessed to the crime, only to be discredited within hours. The more the case unraveled, the clearer it became. Someone out there knew the truth, but no one was talking. Emily's former boyfriend, David Lang, was among the first questioned. He'd dated her the year before, and the community couldn't help but point fingers. His timeline had small inconsistencies, unaccounted hours the night she disappeared, but nothing that linked him directly to the scene. Without physical evidence, police had no choice but to release him. "We can't build a case on hunches," one investigator said at the time. Still, David would remain under quiet suspicion for years. Officers conducted door-to-door interviews, combing through the neighborhood surrounding both the school and Emily's apartment complex. They gathered dozens of DNA samples from men who fit even loosely into the investigation's scope: maintenance workers, delivery drivers, school staff, and known offenders in the area. But each lab report came back negative. The Alabama Bureau of Investigation processed what little physical evidence they had: a partial fingerprint on Emily's car door, tire impressions near the gravesite, and several unidentified fibers. But none produced a solid lead. Meanwhile, fear crept into the fabric of everyday life. Parents stopped letting children walk home from school. Teachers began leaving work in groups, carpooling instead of driving alone. The once open town became wary and tense. Residents started locking doors that had never been locked before. For many, the idea that someone among them, a neighbor, a co-worker, a familiar face, could have committed such an act was unthinkable. Emily's classroom became a shrine. Students left hand-drawn cards and tiny stuffed animals on her desk. Her lesson plans were still written on the whiteboard. Friday spelling test. Someone taped a sign to her chair that read, "We miss you, Miss Dorset." For the children who had adored her, grief arrived before they were old enough to understand what it truly meant. Detectives described the case as a puzzle with too many missing pieces. They mapped timelines, cross-referenced witness statements, and debated motive. Some believed it was a crime of passion, someone close to Emily. Others thought it was a crime of opportunity, a stranger who saw an opening. Without witnesses or usable evidence, every theory felt like a guess. By late 2003, the media attention waned. Leads that once seemed promising now lay buried beneath stacks of paperwork. The investigation team changed hands more than once as officers were reassigned or retired. The fingerprint lifted from Emily's car remained their best hope. A partial print, clean but incomplete. It was uploaded into national databases, compared against every known offender, but no match ever came. Months bled into years. The Dorset family continued to call for updates, each time hearing the same answer. We're still working on it. By 2005, the case file had grown thick enough to fill 2 binders. Inside were timelines, autopsy photos, and unanswered questions, a haunting catalogue of what was known and what wasn't. The posters faded. The story slipped from nightly news to the occasional anniversary headline. Would Emily's case fade forever into the unsolved archives of Alabama's cold cases? By the summer of 2005, the Emily Dorset investigation was quietly reclassified as a cold case. The binders of reports, photos, and evidence logs that once filled detectives' desks were boxed up, labeled, and moved to the archives in the basement of the Willow Creek Police Department. For the small-town force, it was a quiet surrender, an admission that every lead had run its course. The phone stopped ringing, media inquiries faded, and the story that once dominated local headlines became a memory filed under unsolved tragedy. For Emily's parents, though, there was no such closure. Every year on the anniversary of her disappearance, they returned to the elementary school where she had taught, standing before a small granite bench engraved with her name, "In loving memory of Miss Dorset, a light in young hearts." They lit candles, left flowers, and sat in silence as dusk settled over the playground she once watched over. To them, the case wasn't cold, it was frozen in time. Around town, people still spoke of her, though the conversations were quieter now. At church picnics, in barbershops over morning coffee, her name would surface with a sigh and the same haunting question: how could something like that happen here? For many, it became part of the town's identity, an open wound that never healed but stopped bleeding long ago. Parents taught their children to be cautious. Teachers never walked alone at night. The police department, meanwhile, faced turnover and shifting priorities. Detectives retired, transferred, or moved on to newer cases. The file labeled Dorset Emily, Homicide 2002, sat untouched on a metal shelf. Inside, the once crisp documents yellowed slightly around the edges. The bagged items of evidence, fibers, the car door handle swab, the partial fingerprint record, remained sealed, stored under the belief that someday, somehow, they might matter again. And for one detective, that belief never faded. Detective Carla Jennings joined the Willow Creek Police Department in 2012, 10 years after Emily's murder. At the time, she was young, ambitious, and deeply aware of the department's most haunting failure. During slow shifts, she'd wander into the archives, flipping through the cold case shelves. The Dorset file always caught her eye, not because she'd known Emily, but because of the sheer emptiness of the answers inside. The investigation had been exhaustive, yes, but something about it felt unfinished. Jennings made it her unofficial mission to study the case in her off hours. She would reread statements, trace timelines on her office whiteboard, and make notes in the margins. Where was car parked facing? Print partial but clean check again? She wasn't assigned to reopen the investigation. There was no budget, no directive, but something about Emily's story refused to let her go. Then, in 2018, a shift began. Quiet at first, but transformative. Across the country, law enforcement agencies were solving decades-old crimes using a revolutionary new tool: genetic genealogy. Cold cases that had languished for 20, 30, even 40 years were suddenly cracking open. DNA technology, once limited by science, had advanced to the point where even the smallest biological trace could build a family tree and a suspect list. Jennings began to wonder, Had anyone ever tested Emily's evidence under the new methods? She requested access to the archived samples, a move that raised eyebrows among her superiors, but after months of persistence, she got permission to review the inventory. When she opened the old evidence box, she found one small overlooked envelope, unmarked, containing fibers and a faint trace collected from the inside handle of Emily's car. It had been logged, stored and forgotten for 16 years. Now, with technology light years ahead of 2002, it might finally speak. What forgotten clue would technology finally bring to light? By early 2020, 2 decades had passed since the murder of Emily Ray Dorsett. The case file had become part of Alabama's long list of unsolved homicides, until a new partnership between the state's Bureau of Investigation and a private DNA laboratory reignited hope. The lab specialized in advanced forensic genealogy, a cutting-edge method capable of extracting usable DNA from even the smallest biological trace. Detective Carla Jennings was among the first to submit cases for re-examination. When she placed Emily's evidence on the lab's intake list, it wasn't with expectation, it was with faith. The sealed packets contained little more than a smudge of skin cells from beneath Emily's fingernails, a partial fingerprint from her car door, and a few fabric fibers that had clung to her clothing. Back in 2002, that material had yielded nothing. But in 2020, technology had changed everything. Weeks turned into months as scientists carefully worked through each sample. The process was painstaking, scraping, amplifying, and sequencing fragments invisible to the naked eye. Then, in late spring, a quiet email arrived in Jennings' inbox from the lab's director. The subject line was only 3 words long: preliminary DNA results. The findings stunned everyone. Using an enhanced form of touch DNA analysis, technicians had identified a partial male genetic profile, something never before detected in the earlier tests. It wasn't enough for an immediate match in CODIS, the National Criminal Database, but it was a thread, fragile, yet vital. For the first time in 18 years, Emily's killer had left behind a trace that science could finally see. Jennings contacted the State Forensic Genealogy Unit, requesting a familial DNA search. This relatively new investigative tool compared the unknown profile to others in national databases, not for an exact match, but for possible relatives, people who shared segments of DNA with the potential suspect. Weeks later, the results came back. A close biological connection to a man with a minor criminal record in Georgia. That revelation sent investigators into a whirlwind of analysis. Through genealogical mapping, forensic experts and family tree researchers began building the suspect's lineage, branch by branch, using public ancestry records, social media, and archived vital statistics. The data began to converge on a single family, and from there on one particular man. His name was Darren Cole Whitaker, 45 years old, a truck mechanic who in the early 2000s had lived less than 2 miles from Emily's apartment complex. Back then he'd been in his early 20s, quiet, mostly unremarkable, and with no known connection to Emily. But he had once worked part-time doing maintenance at a property just across from Oak Hill Elementary School, the same school where Emily taught. That small overlap became the anchor for the entire theory. Jennings and her team combed through old employment records, interviewing anyone who might remember Whitaker from that time. A retired landlord recalled him vaguely, a loner who kept to himself and left town fast after some trouble with a girlfriend. The pieces, once scattered and forgotten, began aligning like constellations after a long night. A search warrant was quietly drafted for a discarded DNA sample, something as small as a coffee cup or cigarette butt that could confirm the genetic link. As the lab prepared to process the new sample, the air inside the evidence room felt heavier, charged with the weight of long-awaited truth. Detectives who had once worked the original case began returning calls, their voices cautious but trembling with hope. After nearly 20 years of silence, the walls of the Willow Creek Police Department echoed again with the name Emily Dorsett. Now, all that remained was confirmation. Could the man tied by blood to this long-forgotten evidence really be the killer who'd evaded justice for nearly 20 years?